Well, come September this year, it will have been 40 years since I first walked on this property. This building was not even in some architect's imagination way back then. We worshiped up on the hill. Till Evans was not yet serving as the religious educator, and the congregation was in the middle of an interim period, but the interim minister was only quarter time. Therefore, I, as a first-year student at Star King, ended up preaching about once a month, long before I had my first preaching class. I enjoyed laughing heartily in the office with Bev Scaff. I loved Bev Scaff. When I saw her name on the building, I wept yesterday. And I had so many extraordinary experiences here. I remember driving Malvina Reynolds out from Berkeley, where she lived not too far from me, to come and preach here on Sunday, not knowing at the time what a privilege that was. I remember cooking a big dinner here, a fundraiser for liberal religious youth, LRY, with a movie that was shown. I did a lot of weddings here. Oh my God, I actually paid for my second year in Star King by doing weddings, 4 on a weekend. 2 of them were at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm not making this up, 6 o'clock in the morning on top of Mount Diablo, in the fog, and it was an extraordinary experience. And I've been very fortunate in my ministry since I left here. When I did leave here, this congregation got me a beautiful travel bag. And when I came on the plane from Columbus here, I used that travel bag. I've used it for 38 years. Over the years, I preached, I figure, around 1,600 sermons. And of course, I cover the broad themes of life, community, love, grief, fragility, the good, the true, the beautiful, peace, reconciliation, understanding, and of course, forgiveness. And although I read from the great inspiring books of the world, the scripture of the whole world, like Tutu and Dorte Zelle, I found over the years that the great themes rise up most clearly and most profoundly in the living of my life and the experiences which transform book insight into grateful spiritual understanding. I want to share just one of those stories this morning. A learning story, a wisdom story, a very beautiful story, and a story that embodies all of the themes I just listed. It's a story more beautiful even than the lovely story of the lemons this morning, a story which says that when confronted with a wound of the spirit, as Rosalinda experienced when her beloved lemons were stolen and her tree fractured, it's possible to come up with a totally unexpected solution which takes into account the personhood of the one who has done the wounding. This poor man needed to sell lemons to live. Archbishop Tutu, in his moving confession, recognizes that every single one of us can be conditioned, brainwashed is another word, in the systemic matrix of hate and blame and racialization that we all live in, whether it's in the States or South Africa. Even a man as absolutely extraordinary as Tutu is, who had faced the hard truths of apartheid in South Africa head on, even this man found himself thinking things that are totally irrational, yet clearly implanted in all of our heads by a larger system of degradation and dishonesty that divides the human race into the privileged and the unprivileged by birth, the them and the us, and even ultimately, religiously, the saved and the damned. And Dorte Zelle prepares me to understand the story I'm going to tell by reminding me that sometimes expressions of forgiveness are not purposeful acts that we built up to, deliberately chosen through ethical struggle to gain some useful and specific result. But forgiveness can sometimes be a totally beautiful and sudden action, springing spontaneously from the heart. Springing from the heart, just like art and poetry and music, or more sensually perhaps, springing from the earth, just like a perfect rose springs from the earth. A rose which has no why, Zella affirms. Sometimes two people can recognize, like Tutu recognized, that although we are all caught up in a web of national and international blame and distortion and innuendo and deception, which we often mistake for the real truth, something deeper in us, something, if you will, holy in us, he says, something beautiful in us, knows more, knows better. Tutu felt that this very fact should invite us to a deeper compassion, a sense of actual camaraderie, even with folks we have been taught are our enemies. A certain sense of mutual recognition, even though the cultural differences are deep and quite real. And I say anyone who thinks that forgiveness condones things hasn't thought well enough, has much further to go. Forgiveness condones nothing. Forgiveness is not saying, oh, that's okay, never mind, as if someone just bumped you in the hallway. We have things to forgive that are far more serious than that. But it does not mean condone or that's all right. I do give up when I forgive my preoccupation with violence, even though I don't excuse it. I live my life forward when I forgive and not backward. But the beauty of this story reminds me that it makes no sense to isolate compassion and understanding from the definitely hard and cruel realities of the world. This is a realistic story. And you may have to learn a new language in order to lift up this compassionate forgiveness. You may, as in our children's story this morning, have to learn a different form of generosity, one that is, as they say, counterintuitive. But I know I myself can't argue with the title of Tutu's book. Without forgiveness, there is no future. And I, for one, would very much like to have one. So here's the story. From the autumn of 1985 to midsummer 1987, I was lucky enough to chair the Celebration Planning Committee of the IARF General Congress in Palo Alto. IARF stands for the International Association for Religious Freedom. It was and still is an interfaith association of relatively liberal, free-thinking religious groups around the world, and its major concerns are world peace and religious cooperation. And the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association, has been part of it from the beginning. Sadly, right now, it's really shrunk down, and it isn't what it used to be. It's now kind of shrunk down to a kind of a charitable organization over in the UK. But in those days, it was a magnificent organization indeed. It was comprised of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Unitarian and Free Christian groups in England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland, the Unitarian congregations in Central Europe, both in Hungary and in Romania and in the Czech-speaking world. It involved a few Huguenot groups that remained in Europe, the German Free Religious Association, Unitarian groups in India and Sri Lanka, including the Brahmo Samaj, which is kind of like a Unitarian Hinduism, the congregations in the Khasi Hills in India, the Visayan-speaking Universalist groups in the Philippines, a number of Asian Buddhist groups, largest of which is the Risho Kosakai, But last and not least, it involved the Tsubaki Grand Shrine, an ancient Shinto temple in Japan. Now, Shinto is not well known in this country. It's known more here in California than in any of the other 50 states, save Hawaii. I certainly never heard much about it when I was growing up, and I used to confuse it with Buddhism all the time. But I was lucky. Early in my career, I had a chance to meet the high priest, Yukitaka Yamamoto, of the Tsubaki Shrine when he came to the U.S. for a visit. He invited several Unitarian Universalist ministers for dinner, sashimi. I accepted the invitation, and I was also lucky enough at this very congregation to perform what we think was the very first Unitarian Universalist Shinto wedding ceremony with a Shinto priest in the courtyard up there. So I read up on Shintoism and got to know it. And I'm glad I got to know it because when I started working for the Celebrations Committee for the IARF, we were trying to come up with a service that would embrace all of these diverse religious traditions. The Unitarians in Hungary and in Romania pray to the one God. The Shintoists pray to Kami, but Kami, which is falsely translated as God and Goddess, actually means great nature. The German Freireligiose Gemeinde, the Pre-Religious Association, refuse to use the word God in any way, shape, or form. And the Buddhists don't even have a concept of God to accept or reject. So you have all of these things going on, and we didn't know how we were going to do anything. So we thought, those of us here in the States, well, we could use the universal elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and weave services around that until the Japanese Shintoists told us, and the Buddhists, there's not 4 elements, there's 5 elements. Earth, air, fire, water, and metal. What's wrong with you? And the number 4 is kind of like the number 13 is for some people in English. It's the worst luck imaginable, so they don't have 4 elements. I don't know what they do about the directions, but anyway, we went back to the drawing board a number of times, and I had to learn a great deal really quickly. I did get to work with Maya Angelou, the late Maya Angelou, and it was one of the great privileges of my life to spend time with her over at the Stanford Chapel. And by the time the meeting started, I was completely exhausted. I actually lived in the dorms at Stanford for 2 weeks before the meeting, and then the whole meeting was going to be a week long. We finally did everything that we needed to do. We got the services ready, the orders of service in Japanese and in Hungarian and in English. We had translators for everybody else. The celebrations turned out to be beautiful and meaningful. Hard work sometimes actually pays off. But during the week, the conferees also met in small groups, which were predecessors, I think, to our covenant groups. I don't know what you call them here in this congregation, but the small group ministries that have become so prevalent in our congregations. And I decided to attend the group assigned to me. My group, like the others, was supposed to meet for the week every morning from 10 to 11:30 and to participate in structured interfaith dialogue. My group consisted of folks from Prague, some women from Japan, both Buddhist and Shinto, a Brahmo Samaj from Calcutta, a Canadian Unitarian woman, a Transylvanian Hungarian speaker, a Filipino minister, a Nigerian Unitarian, and a Huguenot from Switzerland. A number of us spoke English, but over half of us did not, and some who did speak English had, to my ear, very limiting accents. I found it hard to penetrate the accent myself. So translators were supposed to come to each of these groups to help us with these conversations, and there was a glitch, and we did not get a translator. And we didn't know quite what to do. We didn't even know how to talk to each other about what to do because we all spoke different languages. But one woman suggested something wild, and she got our attention, and she made herself understood with gestures and some drawings on the blackboard. We were meeting in a classroom. She suggested that we meet anyway, but we come up with our own language, which at first sounded like a pretty, crazy idea, but she said, no, let's come up with a vocabulary of about 100 words, and then let's tell our stories, 20 minutes apiece, in our own languages, but use this new language to explain it to everybody else. So we mimed all of this stuff until we all got it and agreed. So we came up and put these on the board, symbols. I'm talking like triangles, circles, little, easy to do drawings, things with crosses through them, whatever. We came up with symbols for birth and death, and marriage and divorce, and children and work and catastrophe, and love, and grief and school, and graduate, and religion, and anger, and peace, and prayer, and meditation, and God, and great nature, and doubt, and faith, and farm, and city, and home, and sickness, and war, and community, and family, and parents, and relatives, and friendship, and move, and stay, and old and young, and ecstasy, and despair. Altogether, we created 80 symbols in a single day. And then for the next days, we each told our stories, using the common language symbols, but speaking in our own language. And we wrote them on a horizontal timeline that we had put on the board. Now listen, Maya Angelou was great. Her sermon was astonishing. These stories were greater. My work for 2 years planning was difficult and wonderful, but these morning autobiographies were more difficult and more wonderful. I heard one man describe the sound of the tanks on the cobblestones as the Soviets rolled into Praha. I heard love stories to rival Romeo and Juliet and David and Jonathan, and family horror stories to make the biblical horror stories like the one about Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar look tame by comparison. I choked at the loss of children, the breaking of lives by war and by poverty. I heard of religious experiences in temples or churches that transformed lives, and I heard of betrayals and misery too big for my small heart to bear. I don't know if this made-up language freed people to go deeper than they would have gone in their own language, but all the folks who shared their lives were forthright and honest, self-revealing, and it was beautiful. One morning, the Canadian Unitarian rose and told the story of how she had went to school in the States and met her American sweetheart. They got married in 1939. The war was clearly approaching. He entered the service, and he ended up being stationed in Hawaii. December 7th, 1941 came, and Pearl Harbor went up in a cloud of smoke. So did her husband's life. She wrote the symbols for death and catastrophe in her timeline. And then she wept a bit. And we all wept a bit. And she went on with her story. Later that morning, the Shinto woman got up. She told of being born in Hiroshima, but meeting her husband in Tokyo, where she summered with her grandparents. The war came, bringing difficult times for her and her family. Her husband was in the armed forces, and he was stationed first in Osaka and then toward the end of the war in Nagasaki. And then she wrote the symbols for death and catastrophe on the board and drew a line through the symbol of husband with a little atomic mushroom cloud next to it. And then she wept a little as she did this. So did we. But then she paused. She glanced over at the Canadian woman. She got up and she walked toward the place where she was sitting. And the Canadian Unitarian woman who lost her husband at Pearl Harbor understood at once and got up and came to meet the Japanese Shinto woman who had lost her husband at Nagasaki. And they simply stood there and looked at each other for a few moments. And then they fell over each other's shoulders, and they embraced, and they wept for a long time. And so did the rest of us. This event, at the center of the IARF conference in 1987, for me, was the main thing at that whole conference, and one of the main things in my whole life. Not Maya Angelou, although I did meet her later and tell her this story. Not my hard work with my committee for 2 years. Not the thrill of helping to lead worship in 20 languages, but this. An embrace and some tears between two strangers who all of a sudden recognized that they were not really strangers at all. No theology of forgiveness could express this basic truth any better. And I, for one, understood immediately why I am involved in the progressive religious organization called the church. The progressive liberal church for me is the institution that supports me as I struggle to proclaim every single Sunday that strangers are not really strangers if you go deep, and that such a message is not only useful but more beautiful than the most spectacular of roses. Now, I learned all this here, of course, when I was a student minister. I've learned the same things. You have to learn things over and over and over again after all. You never learn things just once and for all. And sometimes you have to unlearn things too, like the racialization that we're all born into. What beautiful seeds were planted here in my heart 40 years ago that enabled me to take in and be moved to the core of my being, but what I witnessed in Palo Alto. Let's close the service by singing hymn number 1050.